Our interviews for today are live interviews. You may remember it was a couple of weeks ago in St. Paul, really kind of ground zero for an ICE immigration raid that went sideways. Federal agents were targeting a Honduran national living in a home on Rose Avenue. They say he had domestic assault and disorderly conduct on his record. Also that he'd been deported and then came back into the U.S. illegally, which is a felony. There was a second man living in the house who was also stopped at the same time. But what started as this surveillance and attempted arrest turned into a car crash, eventually a mass protest, and then St. Paul police officers also in that mix. So joining me now to talk about what happened really for the first time in detail is St. Paul Police Chief Axel Henry. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we'll do a couple of things. We'll walk through and do kind of a timeline of November 25th. We know that there are some community members, some city leaders who are asking for answers here around St. Paul PD's involvement. And in the St. Paul City Council, as you know, yesterday formally requested now an independent investigation yesterday. And I know that's gonna hamper you a little bit in what you can talk about today as well.
Yeah, well, out of respect for our community, Mayor Carter, of course, and then of course our City Council, I just want to be clear. We have kind of set up these cadences. I believe this is the third time I've been asked to be on your show, and this was set up long before this happened. Yeah. So we didn't feel like we wanted to cancel it, but I think it's important for the viewers to understand that I didn't run over here today to talk about this, but I also recognize that you're a reporter, this is news, and so folks are going to have questions about it. I just, with an independent investigation happening as well as our internal investigation, I am limited on some of the things I could say, and that's how it should be.
Okay, so let's set that scene. So quickly, it was immigration enforcement, so ICE, HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, and then St. Paul PD. Are these the agencies we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I can't specifically. I mean, I believe the Homeland Security ERO was there. That's enforcement and removal, and then some HSI agents. The groups that typically do this typically try to self-staff themselves because they recognize, and in fact, I think the public might be surprised to know this, they know that we don't want to be involved in these, so they try to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, clearly that wasn't successful here in the situation that escalated out onto our streets that day. But our presence there was not in response to an immigration issue. It was in response to two felony-level crimes that happened, and that escalated out.
So I think that's a good place to start here as a timeline, and obviously not minute by minute, but what can you tell us about that? Because I think obviously a big question for a lot of people is at what point does St. Paul PD get involved and why? So take us through that morning.
So the stuff I'll talk to you today about is stuff that I've already gone on the record of the day of this event. So I don't feel like I'm now trying to steer a narrative in there, because I mean, again, independent means independent. We want to make sure that it gets looked at, and we welcome that. But basically, to your point, the federal officers that were out there, we didn't know that they were out there until we got called and were notified that one of their vehicles occupied by one of their agents had been hit, and it sounds like intentionally, although I'm not involved in that criminal case, by one of the people they were trying to take into custody. That person then fled and then apparently ran into the address on Rose Street in our city. They called us at that point to say, hey, this happened in your jurisdiction. So because crime just occurred in your neighborhood that we're now involved with, and they needed us to write a state accident report.
So that triggers an automatic, that's standard protocol.
Well, I would argue that it should be standard protocol if something like that happens in our city, but they actually needed us to write the accident report. It's a state accident form, and I'm assuming that the federal agents have never filled one of those out if they've never been a local police officer. So we sent an officer up there to write the accident report. We very quickly, you know, we had a conversation. They told us what was going on. They had now set up a perimeter around this address that they told us we're writing a search warrant for, and that turns out to be what we found out later on was the case. So the person went in the home, they started to draft a search warrant for the right to go in there under the judge's order to take this person into custody who had just hit them. Our employee was out there writing the accident report and very quickly saw that a crowd started to gather, so they notified a supervisor and said, hey, you want to probably come up here? There's a crowd forming, and some of them look really, really upset. So they came up there and started to gauge that out as time went on. About 10:30 in the morning, and I may be off by 10 or 15 minutes, I had just left a meeting and I was getting briefed that this was happening. I then personally drove over there and witnessed for myself that a crowd is growing exponentially over very, very quickly. And so we made the decision to close off the street because there were vehicles going back and forth, honking and yelling, and there were tons of people in the street. And so we made the decision that let's close down traffic on the street so no one gets hit by a car. Then as time went on, we learned that someone was injured in there, and our St. Paul fire medics asked us to come and control part of the crowd. You had mentioned the mask piece. I want to be very clear.
Yeah.
Our officers don't wear masks. We don't pull the Bazooka Joe and we pull our turtlenecks up over our faces. We don't do that.
The federal agents do typically, though, right?
Some of them, yeah, they do, and their concern is doxing. Now,
Sure.
we have that same concern, and that happens to our people, and it's actually happened recently to some of our people. But we, as a matter of business, don't wear masks. The officers that showed up at the last stages of this, you know, as the crowd had really assembled and at one point had encroached in and started tearing down their crime scene, and that's why we showed up with some greater presence, had gas masks on. So that's a piece of equipment. That's not an attempt to conceal someone's face. That wouldn't, any more than a firefighter that was wearing a rebreather would be concealing their identity if they went into a building.
Okay, so you know, there's a lot of narratives out there, a lot of people who are trying to, you know, understand when you're triggered to come in, when that exactly was. Is it crowd control? Is it, you know, that first response? Is it protecting federal agents? Because that also is out there as well. What was your role there? And maybe it's multiple.
Well, it's really all of those things. What we don't want to do is we don't have a big clash there. You have a bunch of people up there, and let's be honest, when you hear it was all peaceful protesters, that's not true. But if you hear it's all a mob of angry people, that's not true either. The composition of that crowd is mixed. There wasn't one monolithic opinion. I can tell you that I personally saw a number of very agitated people who arrived there that way. Literally carloads of people being dropped off. What we always try to do is organize with or communicate with the organizers to say, how do we support and encourage First Amendment practices, allow you to monitor things if you want to videotape it so you have a record, which in the subsequent meetings we've had since with organizers, that's very clearly their intent. But also, how do we make it safe for everyone that's there? And that was our intent.
You bring up the video piece of it. A lot of video out there from that day, as there is now. We live in this age where people are documenting, you know, and they're sharing it. There's a piece of video that I'm sure a lot of people have seen from a group called 5051 of a woman standing in front of a van. I know you can't speak specifically to any of that now that these investigations are happening. What do you want people to know as they are watching these video clips online?
Well, I want them to know, first and foremost, we review every single use of force we do. So if you were acting obnoxious in a bar or something, we had to come in and kind of walk you out. We review that, just like we review the highest ends of force. There are hundreds of hours of, or at least probably over 100 hours of video that were recorded by officers just like me that had body cameras on. There's also a bunch of video out there that, you know, we're gathering at the moment from neighbors' Ring cameras and things like that. So yes, there are videos out there that I know that community has questions about, and that's totally understandable. I would love nothing more than to release all the body camera footage out here, and my intent is to do that as soon as I can. But I also have the issue of we are going to have this review, so I want to honor that, and I want to honor that request. You also have the issue that if indeed an employee for the St. Paul Police Department made a mistake or did something that they weren't supposed to do, there's potential discipline that comes out of all of this, and I need to respect that process as well. So I would just ask that the community understand that maybe a 10 or 15 second clip doesn't show the entire context of something, and there are literally hundreds of hours of video out there that are still being gone through that show all these events from different angles. And that's why whenever we can, I know it's hard because this is such an emotional issue for our community, and it's not easy for me either, that we try as best we can to reserve judgment until we've seen all of the evidence so we have a real holistic look at what took place.
How important is it to also kind of hear what's happening as well? I mean, you can see things. Are conversations that are had between law enforcement and protesters on both sides impacting the action that happens next, or is it mostly a physical thing, like if a protester were to push into an officer and physically do something? Or are there words that can be exchanged that you don't hear but you see a reaction?
Oh yeah, I mean, the communication is the key. We had over 210 protests last year, and no one asked us about any of them. We communicate. We're very, very good at doing this. And I know there are people at home right now thinking, well, you're not, because this whole thing happened. But we prefer that. And as a matter of fact, I know, because I've been briefed, I haven't personally watched the videos, that there were lots of people in that group of that crowd that turned and faced the crowd and said, go back. They're just trying to get medic rigs in and stuff. They're doing stuff. So even people within that group had different, varying opinions of what was happening, but were trying to cooperate. And it really illustrates when you get that much emotion in a group that size, It could be sometimes a small number of people that can drive that. I don't know what that actual number is, and to be honest, we probably never will know. But again, that's why an independent review of this needs to happen, and that I think we have to do it in a way that makes sure that our community has confidence in the outcome.
Yeah, and if people want to take the time to listen to some of the interviews that have been done with some of these organizations, I was just listening to one the other day, and they're very clear about their intent is to help protect the people who are being targeted. They're lawfully and peacefully. They are telling their people, if we want to accomplish what we want to accomplish, we need to do this in a certain way. And then to your point, emotion gets involved, and then obviously there are always bad actors in every situation as well. So a lot to think about. What is you talked a little bit about on the scene, so training right now. What does that look like for your officers? Are there refreshers right now, given the number of these and the fact that we will not see the end of this for we don't know how long? What does training look like?
Well, it's everything from what is the most likely scenario that we're going to encounter. Never in my 30-year law enforcement career did I imagine that we would be responding to scenes where another law enforcement agency was there and they might have a different agenda going on. And that's not to disparage the federal agents, but they have a completely different mission than we do. And so that's one of the reasons why we've met with those leaders to say, listen, there are going to be situations that, might get caused that are dangerous, and we need to be having conversations about it's probably time for you to leave or those types of things. I've been very pleased with the fact that they're willing to sit down, they have those conversations. But for our officers, it really is about something totally different than we've ever seen before, because we might actually be going in and having to extract people, or we haven't really in the past had issues where in many violent or emotionally strong environments around pro-gun, anti-gun, pro-life, pro-choice things, if someone gets injured, it typically isn't an issue for everyone to kind of come together and agree and part the sea and let the medics get in there. There's so much energy around this, and there's so much mistrust that created a big issue for us, and that's something we're planning for. But there's also another piece that's really simple, but I think folks should understand. We don't drive around all day with enough officers to have a contingent of people ready to deal with a potential huge protests like this. So we pulled people from regular assignments, and some of them had taken, if you see, we all have our names on our thing, and they're Velcro. And so when I buy a new jacket, I buy a new one of those, and so every piece of garment I have has it on there. We had some folks show up and they threw jackets on because it was cold and they were wearing short sleeve shirts, and that jacket didn't have the outer thing on. So then when a member of our community sees that, they think, oh, you're not making people have their names on it, you're concealing your identity. That is not our intent. That's a failure on our part to make sure that we send our people out with the right equipment. And little things like that can happen, and they can have huge ripples of mistrust, because people could say, well, that was intentional. It probably wasn't for us, but if it turns out that we found out that someone did that intentionally, there would be a consequence for that. So there's training from how we're presenting all the way up to what we're most likely to have to deal with in an environment like this.
There are so many questions from the community. They've been to the City Council. We know that the City Council has requested this formal independent investigation. What are you looking at right now, and what, I guess, changes are being made right now that we don't have to wait for investigations? Is there anything that you've seen where you're like, we can shore that up?
Yeah, I mean, some of this was that equipment piece, but to be clear, we always review use of force. Yeah. So we've started that. We're not stopping. I think some people were concerned. They said, well, now they're doing an independent review, you're going to stop doing your piece. We're not, for the very reasons you described. If an employee made a mistake out there, we have to start having that conversation right away, because this could happen again tomorrow. And we have to make sure that if we made mistakes, we've identified that mistake and corrected that mistake. So that's going forward immediately. Obviously, I want to respect that process and let it play out. But we are already figuring out things that we can make sure we do better. And one of them is, in the future, if it takes me to personally have to, and I did respond to that scene, to personally have to go out there, or the assistant chief or one of my deputy chiefs, to interface with whoever's in charge and say, listen, you're surrounded this house, you're writing for a search warrant, that's completely legal activity on your part, but I don't know that right now that's the best solution to this problem, and that's why we had those meetings, and that's why we're having meetings with the organizers for the people that are protesting. And it's one of the reasons why I reached out to the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bob Jacobson, before this happened, after we had the issue at Brotex, which we didn't have to come into, but we came very close when vehicles got surrounded, to say we need as local law enforcement to come together and start having a conversation, because right now there's like a tug-of-war happening between the two sides, and we're becoming the rope. And we want to honor our community members, but we also, there are some legal things that are happening on this end that, whether I politically agree with them or not, are going to happen. And how do we make sure that we don't cause another issue like we had out on Rose?
We've seen cities like Minneapolis draw boundaries, ice-free zones, right? Is that something that you want to do in St. Paul?
Well, that wouldn't be something that I would even be a part of. That's something that our city council and our elected officials make. I don't think you want police chiefs and police departments deciding what the rules are. You want us to enforce them fairly and evenly. I think they are. They did mention something about that at the hearing yesterday, or the city council meeting. Hearing's not the right word. That they are looking at doing that. Yeah. The separation ordinance that they're referring to was written, I think, in 2004. In fact, one of the units it refers to that would investigate violations of that is a unit that doesn't exist in our city anymore. And so obviously, for even those kinds of reasons, that needs to be looked at. So they're going to look at all that. That's one of the three things that I think they're taking a very serious look at. And that's the other wrinkle, which is a frustration point for me, but that's my burden to bear, is the community can share whatever it wants and say whatever it wants. I have to take a measured approach and say, listen, if we're going to investigate this, then I shouldn't be out pontificating about this. That's why I said what I said at the beginning of the interview, which is I don't want our elected folks to think that they made some statements yesterday, so I ran out and set up an interview with you. This was obviously set up a long time ago. Yep. But I also recognize, as you do, that it's the elephant in the room, so you're clearly going to ask me about it. Yeah. But we want to make sure that everything is done right, and if we made a mistake, we want to know about it. We're going to make ourselves better and hold ourselves accountable. We welcome an independent review. We welcome it, and I hope it happens fast, and I hope they get through it, and we start making corrections if those need to be made. There's a lot of behavior that happened that day, and some of it was against our officers that it needs to be addressed and dealt with.
How much of this do you think can be smoothed over, maybe not fixed, on the front end? Communication, some sort of infrastructure, and I know the pressure is there to not have local PD intermixing at all with these federal operations. Is there a part of you that says, but communication, a basic infrastructure, maybe could help us avoid some of this?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And I've had conversations with state legislators that have R's after their names and ones that have D's after their names, and talked about we could be a leader here in Minnesota for the rest of the country if we found out a way to do this. But we can't start with going to the hyper extremes of where we're angry and every conversation is fueled by emotion. And emotion's not a bad thing. I mean, you're emotional because you care. So that's great, but when we're trying to come to solve the problem, we have to try to sometimes pull back a little bit from that, let the emotion fuel our drive to get to a solution, but not let it cloud our vision while we're trying to identify that solution. And I believe we can do that here in Minnesota. I think we have folks here. Our community is wonderful, and they have great people, and I think if we come together, we can find a solution that honors all parts of this equation and doesn't put anybody in an impossible position.
All right, Chief. We are going to take a break and come back. You just came off of a meeting, I think your first real sit down with the new mayor-elect.
I did.
Is that right? Love to hear about kind of how that went. So we're going to take a quick break and more with Chief Axel Henry from St. Paul PD when we come back.